Well, what about if the session's a zone two bike cardio session? Because obviously, long duration, hard sessions differ a lot from, say, a short duration strength training workout or a yoga workout. So we have to consider the type of the exercise specifically. Hello and welcome back to the Smart Strength Training Podcast. This is the podcast where I talk about popular trends and look at it through an evidence-based lens. And today I'm talking about fasting. Very specifically, I'm answering the question, should women train fasted? Because there is rising interest in fasting and very specifically exercise and the effects of fasting on exercise. Because it's important to point out that there are gender differences when we're talking about the benefits of fasting. And a lot of the research up to this day has been on men. And then the emerging research that's been coming out over the last 5 years has shown that there are sex differences. And that's meant that a lot of people, like social media influencers and fitness coaches, starting to state that like women just shouldn't train fasted, or even more so, maybe women shouldn't fast at all, based on these sex differences. But I don't like these broad strokes, just like blanket rule for all women, because there's more nuance to the topic, and I want to talk about that nuance in more detail. So let's go through and talk about the differences then between men and women. I'm not going to go into the research into men. I'm very specifically going to focus this conversation around the sort of key research into women. So back in 2015, which kind of started this sort of movement towards more female-specific research, there was a review paper that showed that for women, they have lower blood glucose plasma concentrations and higher free fatty acids and lipolysis after fasting than compared to men. And then more recent research has showed that prolonged fast of 72 hours in healthy women leads to marked increases in the stress hormone cortisol, ACTH, and beta endorphin, and other stress hormones. More research has been done on alternate day fasting, and that showed a decrease in androgen markers while simultaneously increasing SHBG levels in premenopausal women. Androgen markers, just your sort of sex hormone markers, so very much aligned to fertility. And then another research paper showed that there were significant decreases in bone mineral density in healthy young women that were following a 4-day fast. So if we sort of review what all that really means. So for women, fasting seems to negatively affect stress hormones such as, and most predominantly, cortisol. It also makes women more prone to hypoglycemia, low blood glucose levels, and causes fluctuations in energy levels. That's due to the rapid mobilization of fat. And it can negatively affect these androgen markers, which affects hormone balance and fertility. So it does, if you just take that at face value, seem that women probably shouldn't be fasting. But let's go into some of the nuance then, shall we? So first up, shorter duration fasting and its implications, because the research I just mentioned, there was a 72-hour fast, a 4-day fast, and alternate day fasting, which is 36 hours. The initial review in 2015, that had participants who did 12 to 16 hours shorter fasts and also 24-hour fasts. And if you actually look at the split difference between those sort of overnight fasts of 12 hours versus the longer fast, there's a significant difference in the outcomes. So it's hard to say that it's just fasting as a whole, or is it more the overall duration of the fast? Because when you start looking at the research specifically into shorter fasts, it starts to get a little bit more mixed and a bit more muddled. In one study in obese women, it found that short periods of intermittent fasting actually improved metabolic markers. And there's other research papers, which I'll link below in the bio, that you can look at as well, that either show mixed results or actually favorable and positive results for short-term fasting for women. So the reason I sort of highlight this one first is because the question that comes up a lot is like, should I eat before a workout? Because it's hard to really define fasting to a very specific time point. If a woman has dinner at 7 p.m. in the evening and then she has to train at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. because of work or childcare, and either doesn't enjoy eating or feels nauseous and can't physically eat before they train, do we still give this blanket rule out? And technically, is that really training in a fasted state? And honestly, it's kind of hard to say because we do need more research on the area. But I would suggest that if you are concerned about the negative impacts of fasting, having heard some of those or having seen other trainers talk about it, then of course I would suggest it's probably worthwhile consuming something before you work out. Maybe like a slice of white bread with jam on, or if you really can't stomach anything solid, then some sort of liquid carbohydrate, ideally in a form of dextrin or maltodextrin, which are carbohydrate sources that you can just mix in water. And I'm focusing this on carbohydrates, and that's quite logical because the negative impacts of fasting are very much based on the lack of energy. And when you work out, certainly when you do resistance training or cardio training, carbohydrates, glycogen, that's going to be your primary fuel source. So when you're thinking about affecting or trying to balance out the negative effects of fasting, then of course carbohydrates is where you'd come in at. And just a sort of side note on that yes, of course you can eat fruit beforehand or like fruit juices, but just remember that fruit juices do contain more fructose, and fructose has to be broken down in the liver and is more likely to be stored as a liver glycogen. And this is first thing in the morning. We want to get that blood glucose or the carbohydrates into the bloodstream as glucose so it can be readily absorbed by your muscles. So as much as there's nothing wrong with having fruit, potentially it's not the ideal thing to use if we are trying to give the muscles energy in that moment in time. That being said, if it was the difference between nothing and fruit and people were concerned, then I would still suggest that fruit is better than nothing at all. So let's stay on this topic of more nuance. Because again, if we just blanket rule that all women shouldn't train in a fasted state, well, what about if the session's a zone 2 bike cardio session? Because obviously long duration, hard sessions differ a lot from, say, a short duration strength training workout or a yoga workout. So we have to consider the type of the exercise specifically, because as I mentioned, some of the research earlier, or actually I didn't mention, but some of the research earlier actually looked at short duration fasting paired with high intensity interval sprints and found favorable metabolic biomarkers. So it gets a bit confusing, right? So that's a short duration, high intensity workout and actually improved some of those metabolic biomarkers. But it's worth stating for that research that actually looked at obese women. And that's something we need to consider because the overall nutrition status of someone also really matters. Again, if we go back to that blanket rule advice, all women shouldn't fast. I do kind of get why some women are, or why some trainers are promoting this to women. From the angle that a lot of women have based their workouts around long cardio sessions, lots of running, trying to stay as lean as possible based on kind of like the social pressure to be with a six pack. So therefore, undernourished themselves, bounce from one restrictive diet to the next. And when they go and throw fasting into the mix, yes, 100% for that population of women, fasting is not a sensible move. And Stacey Sims, who's amazing in this space, and a lot of the research that I'm talking about, I've heard specifically from her. She does a fantastic job, but we have to remember that she operates in this space that is women that are highly active, and women that are highly active and stay very lean. So you have to remember that that's not going to be the same for everyone. And research into lean women shows that hormonal disruption, some blunting of cortisol markers are suppressed as well. But too many coaches have run off with the words that Stacey has said and just sort of blanket rule advice across all women that work out. And that's obviously not the case. And it's a little bit, it's becoming quite common in the female space that there is obviously this huge desire to have female specific research, which is great. And I'm all for it. But then what you get is like all women get chucked into one category together. And then the individual nuance from woman to woman gets kind of lost. And in part, this is due to the fact there's just not a ton of research into women. And yes, there's a lot more research than there was 5 years ago. But if you look at the male research, certainly the male research into fasting, you've got like 2 decades worth of research to look back onto. So some of these things are very sort of nuanced niche topics that haven't been properly researched yet. Speaking of niche topics, let's also discuss stress and sleep status, because we've discussed so far the duration of the fasted window, the type of workout and duration of the workout that you do could affect things. But what about one's overall nutrition status coming into the fast? And what about sleep and stress? Sorry, we've discussed nutrition. What about sleep and stress? Because we know that stress negatively affects things like sleep, and that long fasting affects cortisol, therefore will affect sleep. And that there's one study that I'm aware of that's looked at 24-hour fasting in sleep-deprived women, and surprise, surprise, they found that increased or elevated cortisol, it disrupted menstrual cycle, impaired fertility, impaired glucose metabolism, and a load of other really bad things. There was no exercise intervention in this particular study. It is just a fast. It was a 24-hour fast. So it's hard to know what you can draw from that when we're talking about short fasts, and in scenarios where people aren't chronically sleep deprived, but it is worth thinking about. And I can't even begin to tell you how niche that actually is, as far as or niche a topic it is in the framework of research. It's just an example of how many gaps currently exist in this sort of research field, even though it's actually a really important topic, and it's a research question that does need answering. But that's just the kind of pace in which you see these sort of research papers come out. Okay, so let's just summarize and go through what we've just gone through. I think the best thing for me to do here is to go through and talk about who should fast and maybe who shouldn't fast. So fasting or training fasted is probably fine if you train first thing in the morning. So it's not a very long extended window and you've got, say, 12 hours or under 12 hours as a fast window, you're probably okay. Yes, especially if your workouts are short and not crazy intense. So if they're 30, 45-minute strength session, you're going to be fine. If you're starting to push over that hour mark, I would definitely consider some kind of liquid carbohydrate or something like that to make sure that you sort of protect yourself against some of those negative or potential negative outcomes. And also, probably not most importantly, but certainly very importantly, if you're not dieting. So if you're not necessarily consuming in an energy deficit, or certainly not a deep, like low energy deficit, then you probably are fine to train fasted. But I would suggest, though, if you are going to work out in the morning and you generally are eating enough food as a whole, and actually this is true of anyone, I would always state that if you work out first thing in the morning, that your evening meal becomes your pre-workout meal. So therefore making sure that you get enough food in that meal and don't go for a light meal. And I would prioritize carbohydrates to make sure you've got half a chance of having adequate fuel source for going into that workout in the morning. So then who shouldn't fast or who shouldn't train fasted? So if you do long workouts, 60-minute plus, and they are hard, so you're training for a triathlon, you're doing marathon training or something, and your workout duration is high, I probably wouldn't suggest that training fasted is a sensible thing to do. If you are fasting for over 16 hours and then you're putting your workouts into the end of that fasted window, once again, that wouldn't be suggested. I would strongly advise some kind of pre-workout nutrition prior to your training bout. And of course, then if your overall status of nutrition has got you into a pretty lean position, or you've only got maybe a few kilos, 5 kilos to lose, I probably wouldn't bother with it because of the potential negative side effects are just not going to outweigh the sort of net positive that potentially fasting could create for you. And I think that's also really important to point out. You've got to ask, like, what are the benefits as far of fasting as a whole, and do they outweigh some of those negative sort of side effects to it? And I think that's one of those ones that we have to just be very aware of, because there are a lot of proposed benefits to fasting that probably aren't as significant as some of the people in the industry are making out. If you're also staying on topic with people that shouldn't fast, if your entire training revolves around calories in, calories out, and burning as many calories as possible, then I would strongly advise not to do fasting, training in a fasted state as well, simply because you're probably utilizing way too much energy through your workouts as a whole. And then I've added this one on here as well, but I didn't really discuss this on the podcast because it's probably a podcast of its own. But fasting for women going through or coming into or going through menopause, for now, I'm just going to say that adds an extra level of consideration. And if you're going through menopause and you're not really sure where you sit between the two lists that I've just gone through, I would err on the side of caution, and I would suggest to not fast in that state. And then finally, to wrap this up, I guess there's a conversation around fasting and obesity, and I wasn't going to mention this, but I decided last minute to add it in. There's a big challenge here for anyone that is overweight or obese, because fasting might be a really convenient way to bring your energy intake down. And if you work out at some part of the day where the workout just happens to fall in a fasted window, and you know there's a list of negatives, that has to be weighed up against the risks of not acting and the health implications of obesity. So I don't have an answer to that, but it's certainly something that does need to be considered when people are thinking about their reasons to fast, and if there are other really important health benefits to the need to be fasting in the first place. So hopefully now, off the back of that, you're aware that this is a very complex topic, that it's not a one-size-fits-all method. There are some nuances that need to be considered if you do intend to use fasting as a method within your own nutrition. And this emerging data has become quite conflicting for people. Fasting is a practice that a lot of women have been using for years. So I'd love to hear some of your own experiences and thoughts on fasting and exercise.